We've come to the Chignecto Isthmus on Canada's east coast to explore a historically contested space that would play a critical role in the fight for North America. From the rich cultural heritage of Indigenous groups to early French settlers who'd become Acadians, to European powers fighting for control of it all, we'll see how and why Acadians engineered their impressive dike networks, how the British and French constructed 3 forts for what would become their final standoff, and how, ultimately, the battle for the Chignecto Isthmus would lead to the Acadian Expulsion. The Chignecto Isthmus, where we are right now, is actually pretty small, but it's been of strategic value for thousands of years, linking the Atlantic world. Long before Acadians ever came here, it was home to local Indigenous peoples, the Mi'kmaq. Chignecto, the traditional Mi'kmaq name for the Chignecto Isthmus, meaning the land where the water drains, perfectly describes this region's unique geography with one of the largest salt marshes on the Atlantic coast of North America, broken up by rivers that rise and fall with the tides, a complex land with a complex history. As the Mi'kmaq moves seasonally to best access natural resources, trade, and use the portage routes throughout this region, the Chignecto Isthmus became a natural meeting point as bands moved from one place to another. An early crossroads linking land and sea, not to mention people, trade, and ideas. Its position making chiefs of this area particularly valued leaders because of its centrality. But we know with European arrival, everything would change. The first Europeans to the isthmus arrived in the mid-1500s as fishermen and traders, but it wasn't until Champlain arrived in 1604 that the region was properly mapped. On this expedition, they would eventually make a settlement at Port Royal, Lower Annapolis, which would feed the growth of what would become a significant Acadian settlement to the north of it, on the Chignecto Isthmus. It was the early 1670s. France held Acadia, mainly made up of present-day New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. And the area was well populated with both second-generation Acadians and the French. It was in these early years that the Acadian settlement of Beaubassin was founded. And for those who may not know, Acadians were French settlers who settled in Acadia and developed their own unique culture, which is still present today. Its small but growing population would plow the fields, raise livestock, build ships, trade, and do all the things needed to keep a successful settlement running. The problem was that this area was really just a mix of salt marshes and rivers that would flood with salt water at high tide. What were you supposed to do with that? So Acadians needed a way to make the land fertile for their crops and livestock, none of which would have been possible if it weren't for the dike systems they constructed next. This system was in use nearby, from Port Royal to Grand Pre, and was a technique likely imported from practices established in the La Rochelle region of western France. Many Acadians could actually trace their lineage back to western France, on the Atlantic coast, much like here, that was just covered in salt marshes, and there they diked. And this tradition was used for thousands of years, from the Roman period onward, and this traditional knowledge ended up coming right here on the Chignecto Isthmus.
So unfortunately, it's extreme high tide right now, and we can't see any of the historic sluice gates that are at this location. Now Lauren's got a really good map of some other locations near us that might have some historic sluice gates, aboiteaux, so we're gonna have to take a look at those and come back.
It was clear that we needed to explore beyond the Chignecto Isthmus in order to learn more about these Acadian aboiteaux. With the help of a few specialized tools, particular types of spades, pitchforks, axes, and hollowed-out tree trunks, wetlands and marshes could be transformed into arable land. And while you might picture dikes as dirt mounds several meters high made of chunks of sod, the most clever part of this whole system was something called aboiteaux, or sluice gates. These sluice gates were situated wherever the dikes crossed paths with the rivers that snaked through this marshland. The gates were wooden and hung vertically so that when water pressure from the rivers would build, the gates would be pushed open, allowing the fresh water to rush out. In reverse, as the tide would rise, the gates would hold firm, shutting tightly against a sill that would keep tidal salt waters from entering, a system still used today.
Well, there we go. That's what we were looking for. So this is actually an even better example of an aboiteau that's been modernized. So you can actually see that the gates are down here, and it really shows, you might think of dike systems being, really big dirt mounds, but there's actually quite an engineering feat involved with them that we're still using today.
But we were still curious. We wanted to find some historic sluice gates. So we decided to continue on our journey. This system was quite clever in its simplicity, manipulating the flow of natural processes without large-scale capital intervention, creating highly productive agricultural lands, leading to a healthy trade industry with local indigenous groups, nearby settlements, throughout New France and Boston.
We are in Memramcook, New Brunswick, having followed our map that has exact coordinates of where historic aboiteaux should be in the region. And we're on a dike right now, so we suspect that there should be a aboiteau somewhere around here. So based on our information, the aboiteau we're looking for should be right over there. But it's actually really interesting to kind of see it from this perspective, with the tide being low. You can kind of see this trickle of water coming out right around here and into the larger basin. And because of the mud flats, you can just imagine how high that water is at high tide. So you can see how the aboiteau would be effective holding that back from coming into the rivers inland. We made it to the aboiteau, and this one looks properly historic. It's so neat to be able to actually come somewhere and see something that is historic but actually still being used today. And when you see the agricultural lands here, you can really tell that it's actually still very much of use. So we came a little bit farther down the road from where we just were because our map showed us that there should be another aboiteau. And take a look at this one. This is so cool. It might even be better than the other one. Really neat.
Now we felt ready to head back to the Chignecto Isthmus.
It's true, yeah.
So we've returned to the Chignecto Isthmus, armed with a greater understanding of what made this place historically significant.
The centuries-old dike systems that flanked these hillsides ensured that a thriving society could emerge. This simple system of managing and cultivating productive lands, making a comfortable home for a large Acadian population. It fueled the growth of a distinct society and identity with complex interactions with others, including New England and the Mi'kmaq.
And, as you can see, this wouldn't be the first or last time that the natural environment would be harnessed on the Chignecto Isthmus. The dikes really embodying the complex nature of life here. But soon, all of this would be threatened. The early history of the Chignecto Isthmus would give way to a complex period of conflict between the British and the French, one that would draw in the Mi'kmaq and Acadians.
The 1713 Treaty of Utrecht ended a decade-long conflict between Britain and France, which included, of course, territorial disputes regarding Acadia. Although this treaty brought peace to the Chignecto Isthmus for a time, it also ensured it would be a source of future conflict, as territorial divides were left undefined. These boundaries remaining so even after the signing of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, which simply left these old indeterminate borders, leaving the Beausejour River as the unofficial line of separation between British and French territory. It wasn't just the lack of territorial clarity on the Chignecto Isthmus that would cause concern for North American colonies. This area was a crossroads that enabled prosperous Acadian trade networks, critical French supply routes between Quebec and Louisbourg, and fertile lands that drew New England's interest.
There could be little doubt that this area would be the next strategic prize.
A succession of English and French governors throughout North America maintained policies of territorial expansion using trading posts and forts along disputed boundaries. British and French policies were simultaneously defensive and offensive, reinforcing what they had while expanding into what they wanted.
These tensions between the British and French building until eventually they would bring an end to what could be seen as much simpler times enjoyed by the Acadians of Beaubassin.
In 1750, the French sought to defend what remained of their interest in Acadia by reinforcing their portion of the Chignecto Isthmus, where, under the order of Jacques-Pierre de la Jonquière, the Governor-General of New France, plans were set in motion to build a fort.
To counteract this policy, the British would send an expeditionary force of 400 men to the Chignecto Isthmus under the command of Major Charles Lawrence. Their purpose, to push French troops out once and for all.
We can't forget that the British had serious concerns. Their problems were many, including the fact that while Acadians technically lived in British territory, they continued to want neutrality, refusing oaths of total allegiance to Britain. They continued to want to practice their Catholic faith, which meant they were more susceptible to French influence, and they continued to maintain close ties with Indigenous people, all of which hindered British influence and control.
These tensions were only amplified by the fact that Acadians lived on some of the most fertile lands in Nova Scotia, while refusing to swear unconditional allegiance to anyone.
Lawrence's invasion was met with a determined French response. This included driving out the Acadians of Beaubassin from their village, burning it to the ground, so that they could not fall into British hands. This being especially important considering it sat firmly within British territory.
These Acadian refugees being pushed into French territory just across the Missaguash River, the French succeeding in deterring the British for now.
In September of that same year, the British would return with 700 soldiers to establish a fort in the Chignecto Isthmus. Just as before, local Acadian and Mi'kmaq militia opposed this British landing, leading to a brief battle. The British were ultimately successful and began construction of a fort on the ruins of Beaubassin, Fort Lawrence. This would be a well-positioned, four-corner bastioned wooden fort with a deep ditch surrounding it, with a battery of guns facing north to the opposite ridge, where the French claimed territory, only 2 kilometers away. French authorities gave the order under Jacques-Pierre de la Jonquière, the Governor-General of New France, to construct a palisaded fort at Point Beausejour, in order to counter British militarization of the isthmus. This new French fort would be known as Fort Beausejour. Lieutenant Gaspard Joseph de Lery would direct its construction, beginning in April 1751. It would be a rather unique fort, in fact a star-shaped bastion fort with 5-meter-high earthworks, the very first of its kind in North America. This in contrast to typical forts of this period, which usually were square, with 4 bastions, one at each corner. In order to build and arm this fort, supplies had to be brought in, but there was one problem. The Bay of Fundy, where Fort Beausejour was located, was controlled by the British Navy. So, to bypass this control, goods had to be transported across the Chignecto Isthmus from the Northumberland Strait.
Just imagine what it would have taken to actually build this fort. Like, it's imposing just as it is now. They would have had to bring in all of these men and supplies to build this from all the way across the isthmus. But how would they accomplish this? Let's go find out.
At first, the French established 2 supply depots in nearby Shediac, from which supply ships carrying troops, tools, materials, and weapons were unloaded for transport across the isthmus to the new fort. But this was not an easy 29-kilometer route, with goods transferred from ocean to land to river and back to land again. It was clear a new road and depot would be crucial. This new supply road would follow a very old and well-used portage route across the isthmus, used by local Indigenous peoples for thousands of years.
In that same year, they would build a small but critical fort on the opposite side of the Chignecto Isthmus on the Northumberland Strait, called Fort Gaspereau. Its purpose, to receive and transport goods across the isthmus to Fort Beausejour. Built in 1751, this fort was never meant to withstand an effective siege. It was literally a warehouse for the French, and a link between Quebec, the fortress of Louisbourg, and Fort Beausejour.
It was just a small palisaded fort, about 100 feet on all sides, manned by only a garrison of no more than 14 soldiers at any one time. It consisted of earthen walls, a shallow ditch, and palisade, with a blockhouse at each corner outfitted each with a small cannon.
And now that we know why these forts were built, and how, we're curious, where's the kaboom? The spark that would ignite the battle between Fort Beausejour, Gaspereau, and Lawrence would come from many miles away. This trigger being called the Ohio Dispute.
It would be a geopolitical one, and as is so often the case, it would include land, centered around British and New England fears of French encroachment to the west and north of the American colonies. To combat this concern, New Englanders devised a plan which would see 4 key border regions simultaneously attacked, specifically Ohio in the west, Crown Point and Niagara in the north, and the Chignecto Isthmus in the east. The hope was to do this all at once and quickly because there was worry that the French could send even larger forces to America or bring the fight to Europe.
The campaign for Fort Beausejour was partially made possible by one Thomas Pichon, a French administrator, who would provide invaluable information to his British patrons at the cost of his French compatriots.
Utilizing Pichon's information, on May 19, 1755, about 2,000 New Englanders and another 270 British Army regulars under the experienced command of Colonel Monckton left Boston en route for the Chignecto Isthmus with 31 transports and 3 warships.
News of this impending British force would arrive at Fort Beausejour, sending its leadership into a flurry of activity, because not only did they actually have to prepare for this, they also had to repair their inadequate infrastructure.
June 2, 1755 saw the arrival of this British force at the head of the Beausejour River in the Bay of Fundy. Here they offloaded provisions and cannons, marching them to Fort Lawrence.
2 days later, Colonel Robert Monckton ordered his men to cross the Beausejour River en route to Fort Beausejour right here.
At the river, they met a force of about 400 rebels who were under the command of Joseph Beausoleil-Broussard, a legendary Acadian resistance leader. After a brief exchange of cannon and swivel gun fire, the French resistance realized they were outgunned and outnumbered, so they withdrew back to Beausejour. As they retreated, the French passed by an Acadian settlement built by those who had lived in Beaubassin. Not wanting to leave anything behind that might benefit the British, they burned it to the ground. Acadian refugees watching as their homes were once more destroyed.
After this initial success, the British began surrounding Fort Beausejour, establishing control around it, ready to besiege and bombard it.
For their part, the French tried to slow their progress, utilizing the dikes as cover to launch counterattacks, hoping to buy those in the fort more time to repair defenses and for reinforcements to arrive.
Just imagine 2,000 British soldiers surrounding this fort, launching attack after attack, knowing what was at stake.
Throughout the bombardments, the vastly outnumbered French continued scrambling to reinforce their defenses, made all the more challenging by the motley crew of those who wanted to be there and those who didn't. Eventually, the attacks would become so intense that the French would abandon their posts, retreating to the casemates within the fort.
As the siege continued, those within Fort Beausejour would run into the casemates, which were considered bomb-proof, but a shell would land in one, killing all those within it. Just imagine being an Acadian who's here against their will, in these dark, damp halls of this fort as the British bombarded day after day.
At this point, Beausejour was in a terrible state. Large sections of the fort were blown to bits, there weren't enough supplies to tend to the wounded and dying, and no reinforcements were coming from Louisbourg. Short-handed and increasingly mutinous, Fort Beausejour could endure no more, falling on June 16, 1755.
Fort Gaspereau would surrender soon after the fall of Fort Beausejour right here, ending French control on the isthmus thereafter.
The French forts would assume new names under English rule. Fort Beausejour would be maintained because it was ideally located, but undergo massive renovations and be renamed Fort Cumberland. Fort Gaspereau would become Fort Moncton.
In the end, Fort Beausejour's walls would not be strong enough to hold back British expansionism in North America, ultimately leading to the 7 Years' War between Britain and France.
And while the French may have surrendered Fort Beausejour and nearby Fort Gaspereau to the British, a bigger loss from this battle was the beginning of the removal of all Acadians from British-controlled territory, the Acadian Expulsion.